Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. This week, President Trump unveiled sweeping tariffs, announcing a 10% tariff on all imports to the U.S. and additional tariffs on 60 of the U.S.'s greatest trading partners. Joining us to break these tariffs down and talk about their economic impact is my colleague, Giacomo Tognini. He is a staff writer on the Forbes Wealth team. Giacomo, thanks so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Maggie.
So there are a lot of numbers that we're about to dive into, and let's start with the ones that everyone is talking about, these tariffs. Can you break down for us which countries and territories were the recipients of the highest tariffs?
Right. So actually, some of the highest tariffs, if you look at it, are on fairly small countries that don't trade a ton in the U.S. with the U.S. So Madagascar is one, for example, Lesotho in Africa. But then if we're looking at which ones actually matter for trade with the U.S., China was hit with an additional 34%. The EU was hit with 20%. Vietnam, another large trading partner, more than 40%. And so I think when we're looking at the impact, we're really looking at these larger economies, South Korea, Japan, India, Taiwan as well, which are all, I think, we're within that sort of higher than 20% range.
20% additional tariff on the EU, 34% on China. These are huge figures on major American trading partners. Do we know how President Trump calculated these tariffs?
Right. So if you looked at the chart that he was holding during the announcement, they said that they were basically calculating it based on the tariffs that those countries impose on the U.S., plus currency manipulation and other trade barriers. Now, it's unclear if that's what they did for all the countries, but some economists have done some analyses in the past couple of days, and I think on at least 70, more than 70 of the more than 180 countries that were targeted with tariffs, what was actually imposed was basically they took the trade deficit, so the difference between what the U.S. imports from that country and what the U.S. exports to that country, and then they divided it by the total the U.S. exports to that country, and then they took that percentage, that number, and then divided it by half. And that's what they imposed. So in many of these cases, it's a pretty simplistic calculation that they did. And if you look at China, for example, beyond the what he imposed yesterday, there's the additional tariffs he'd already imposed. So the actual overall tariffs on China are more than 60% now, based on these analyses.
What does that mean for the American consumer?
I guess it's too early to tell, but likely, it depends who's going to ultimately bear that cost, right? Will it be the importers? Will it be, the companies themselves, any one of those companies along the chain? Or, will it ultimately be consumers, which is often what happens with tariffs?
Now, President Trump has been calling these reciprocal tariffs, but in the calculation that you just laid out, the trade deficit comes into play. Can we talk a little bit more about the trade deficit? Because I think there are some cases where I saw a line in a New York Times story about how Americans might want to buy more Japanese electronics than Japan might want to buy of something American. So would that create a trade deficit? Mm-hmm. And is that trade deficit correctable by tariffs?
Right. And I think a trade deficit is not in and of itself good or bad, right? It could be that the U.S. is importing a lot of goods from a country that it could make better and cheaper internally, but doesn't for whatever reason. Or it could be, like in the cases of these, textile and clothing imports from countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, that there's, competitive reasons why it's cheaper, for companies like Nike and Adidas to make, shoes and clothes in those countries, right? The labor is cheaper, that it might not be able, it might not be possible to do that in the U.S. I think one example that I saw, which was interesting, was, the small African country, Lesotho, which was hit with massive tariffs. That's because they export a lot of diamonds to the U.S. I mean, a lot. Their biggest export is diamonds. And the U.S. exports very little to them because they have a small GDP, it's a small economy. The U.S. can't start producing diamonds tomorrow in the U.S., right? And Lesotho is not really wealthy enough to be able to buy as much from the U.S. that the U.S. exports there. So that's a case, it's a simple case that doesn't have a huge impact on the U.S. economy, right? But it kind of illustrates where it might not even be possible to eliminate a deficit there. Obviously, that's different, right? Like when you talked about Japan, China's a bit more complicated, right? Because it used to be that a lot of manufacturing went there because it was cheaper. That's not the case anymore. It really depends on what you're looking at. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk lately of producing more semiconductors in the U.S., for example. Right now, Taiwan is the leader In that, Taiwan was also hit by tariffs. So I think it seems that what they're trying to do is eliminate these deficits. That might not always be possible in every case, and it might not, it might be good to do that with some countries, right? But not necessarily in all cases.
The Sutu example is a really good one, though it does create a business opportunity for lab-grown diamonds if the tariffs stay in place.
Right,
but that's the subject.
I'm not an expert on the lab-grown
exactly.
diamond industry,
That's a subject for a different segment. So as you've been looking at this then, are there countries that have been imposing high tariffs on American business that deserve the reciprocal tariffs?
It's a little tough to tell, but the World Trade Organization does calculate what they call the weighted average tariff on that countries impose, and it is true that the U.S. was generally imposing lower tariffs before this than most other countries, but they were all sort of below 5%. They were all quite small. The EU came out, for example, the European Commission said that they imposed a tariff of around 1% on on U.S. goods. With an exemption, for example, that cars were had a tariff of 10%. But within this argument, right, the U.S. a couple weeks ago, I think, imposed this extra, this other 25% tariff on cars and car parts. That's separate from what was announced 2 days ago. But it really depends. I think India was imposing around 10%. Many of the other countries that have been hit now were below 10%. So in pretty much all of these cases, what the U.S. is imposing now is far higher than what these countries were imposing before. Still, it is true that the U.S. was lower than most countries before. And then you also have another side of this where even with countries where the U.S. had a trade surplus, right, so the U.S. was exporting more to them than they were importing from those countries, they still applied now a 10% tariff across the board. It's like the UK is one where tariffs were very low, if any, and now there's a 10% tariff on UK as well.
We've talked about a few different sectors of business, right? Semiconductors, apparel, diamonds. But as you've been looking at these tariffs, are there one or two sectors that are standing out to you as like, wow, this is really going to get slammed over the coming months?
Yeah, I mean, I think apparel is a big one, right? I was looking at, I'm on the wealth team that works on the Billionaires list. And I think just yesterday alone, we had at least 3 billionaires falling off of the list. So, their net worth going below $1 billion in the apparel industry. So like this company listed in Hong Kong that, relies on the U.S. for most of its exports. They produce for, I think, some of the largest, the Gap, Abercrombie and Fitch, for example. Their stock's already tanking. You also see things like furniture. Yesterday the stock of RH Restoration Hardware was tanking. Actually, the former Billionaire CEO, Gary Friedman, was on an earnings call 2 days ago, and when he saw the stock tanking, during the call he said, "Oh shit!" Like that was his reaction. So those are two industries that I've seen be hit. Obviously, the automotive sector is going to be hit. We already knew about that from the auto tariffs before. It's interesting though that some sectors have been exempted. So for now, for example, semiconductors are not subject to tariffs. Energy, including oil, is also exempt, and then also rare earths and minerals that aren't available in the U.S. I think the administration has said they may be subject to tariffs later. But if you're looking at it now, it's pretty much any good that is not easily produced in the U.S. or isn't anymore because of labor costs or whatever. So obviously apparel is a big one. Another thing which may be getting a bit too in the weeds, but there's another big change that happened this week, which is something called the de minimis exemption. So basically, any good, I believe, that was worth below $800 was sort of not subject to tariffs or checks when coming into the U.S. So this is a lot of goods that came in from companies like Shein and Temu, right, which have exploded in the last few years. And so by now extending the tariffs to those goods as well, think about a lot of online shopping and things like that, or things, again, clothes, things we buy from those kinds of stores, those will be good.
Someone asked me this week, is this the end of Temu? Do we know yet?
It's interesting. I was reading about that today. Apparently Temu and Shein as well have been investing a lot in warehouses in the U.S. So again, it'll be interesting to see, a lot of these companies are multinationals that will have been planning contingencies for this. Obviously, it's not as, easy depending on the industry you're in, but I'm sure they'll have figured out ways to sort of limit the impact of these.
Well, getting more manufacturing in the U.S. is part of President Trump's goal, and whether he's successful remains to be seen. But another thesis out there is that these tariffs are a really blunt negotiating tool that the president is using. And already we have seen, he said today that he had a very good call with officials in Vietnam, and they seem ready to eliminate their tariffs on the U.S., according to reporting that broke this afternoon. Do we believe that? Do we think that, is that already off the list of tariffs, or is it too soon to say?
Well, it definitely does seem like, even President Trump's son, Eric, posted on Twitter, I believe yesterday, the day before, saying, he would want to be the country that is the first to negotiate with Trump because then they'll win and not be the last one. So, we see in China, for example, impose retaliatory tariffs. Vietnam, instead, like you said, is negotiating. And I think that seems to be the, if you hear noises out of Europe, some leaders are saying, let's hit back. Others are saying, let's negotiate. It seems to me that, these are big numbers and probably designed to have these countries come to the table and come to a deal. I mean, in the first Trump administration, right, he wanted to pull out of NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, and then he renegotiated a new trade deal called the USMCA. Even when he imposed tariffs on Canada and Mexico last month, he paused them for any goods that were already covered by that trade deal. So clearly, I'm not at liberty. I don't know if this is all a negotiating tactic, but clearly that seems to be the strategy where it's designed to have these companies come to the table and come to some sort of agreement with the U.S. where, trade deals take a long time to negotiate, and if he's able to do that faster and get a better result, then that might be, beneficial to the U.S. and those countries in the long term.
And maybe the markets would settle a little bit. But I'm glad you mentioned Mexico and Canada, because I saw something online, someone saying something about get your avocados and tomatoes, but Mexico and Canada are not on the list unveiled this week, and that is because of the most recent trade agreement with those two countries?
Right, and most agricultural products, to the avocados and tomatoes point, are covered by that. Then, obviously the auto industry has also been getting a lot of attention because of the additional tariffs he put on those. But with Mexico and Canada, he's paused the tariffs twice. It's unclear sort of where those negotiations are going to go, but clearly those leaders are already, in discussions with the administration, have been for months now. So it seems like at this point, the Mexican avocados and tomatoes are still safe. But we'll have to see if that changes. But for now, that's still covered by that deal.
So our guac is safe. Now, you mentioned some of the billionaires who are now no longer billionaires, and earlier this week, you and your team published the list of the world's billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
And
just in time, yeah.
Just in time for the markets to completely change some of their fortunes. And you published a story yesterday talking about some of the biggest losers. So can you break down for us which billionaires have lost the most money in just the past 2 days?
Right. I mean, first of all, it's relative, right? These are all, people who are still worth, even the ones who have fallen off, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? But yesterday, so just looking at the market close yesterday, the world's, more than 3,000 billionaires lost about 270 billion. So, that's including some of them that actually got richer, like Carlos Slim in Mexico, for example. But the biggest losers were Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison, Elon Musk. So all, tech billionaires, obviously Elon, Tesla, which had some other issues with lower sales, but we really saw a huge broad sell-off, right? The S&P 500 index was down about 5%. NASDAQ, which is more tech-focused, 6%. And, for these, for Bezos and Zuckerberg, we're talking about losses greater than $10 billion yesterday, which continued into today. I haven't checked the full numbers today, but they've continued. So, they've lost collectively tens of billions of dollars. And I think what's interesting is that some of these largest losers are billionaires who have been trying to get closer to the administration lately. Obviously Elon has been close to Trump for quite a while now. Ellison, going back years, has been backing Republicans. But, Zuckerberg and Bezos attended the inauguration and have been trying to get closer recently. But I don't know that it's the tariffs specifically that have impacted their companies. Right? I mean, Amazon, I guess, is different because it's e-commerce and retail. But it's just like you were saying, the impact that they've had on the markets, and investors really having this broad sell-off that has inevitably hit these large companies.
Even if you look at Warren Buffett, I was looking at the Forbes real-time wealth value for Buffett right before we started recording, so this might be out of date by the time this goes up, but he was down close to $10 billion. And that is someone who has diversified holdings. We know a lot about his investment strategy, and I don't think he's been getting super close to the administration or speaking out on this one way or the other. So his portfolio is probably more reflective of the broader market drop.
Right, and Berkshire Hathaway has been hoarding cash for quite a while now without sort of spending it on acquisitions. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what his take is on all this as well.
We always want to hear from Warren Buffett. That's one of my questions. What will be your biggest questions as you talk to your billionaire sources over the coming days and weeks?
I think it'll be interesting to see how much they're changing their business plans, if at all. Obviously, that'll depend a lot on the industry, but there hasn't been a lot of billionaires coming out and saying much. I was looking at it, today before this interview. Elon Musk said a couple weeks ago that although Tesla produces a lot of cars in the U.S., they'll still be impacted by the auto tariffs. He hasn't come out and criticized them. Bill Ackman, who is frequently posting on X, agreed with the post saying that this is a negotiation tactic. So I think there will be some that will come out and be critical of the tariffs. At this point, it's kind of a political thing, though, right? Whether they say anything publicly or not. But, we had been expecting tariffs for a while, right, from the Trump administration. I think the magnitude of them was sort of surprising to a lot of people. But it's still really early to tell, right, what's going to happen. Because also, like we were talking about earlier, are these big numbers really going to stick on all these countries? Like, if Vietnam cuts a deal with the U.S., will other countries cut a deal? Like, how long will these tariffs actually be in place, and what kind of impact will they have, and for how long? I think that's going to be really telling, and I'm curious to see, sort of what the billionaires on our list who talk to us have to say about that, and whether they are, taking steps right now to deal with these tariffs and the impact, or whether they're still going to wait and see what the impact is.
Well, if you're a billionaire and you're watching, please call Giacomo. We want to hear from you. It
or
sounds like a
team.
joke, but really, I think the way the business community is engaging with this, you said it's a political question, but it's also fundamentally a business question. And at what point will it become untenable to be silent?
Right, and sort of to tell their investors, right, if they're public companies, what they plan on doing about this.
Giacomo, thank you so much for sitting down and breaking this down for us. We so appreciate it.
Thanks, Maggie.